Hello there, Daniel.
Hey, how are you, Nicole?
I'm great. I'm even better now that we're together and have this opportunity to talk.
Excellent,
Really,
excellent.
really
I'm
looking
really
forward
excited
to it.
about what you've been doing on your channel. I think this is going to have a lot of reach. I think this is going to be beneficial to people. I think there's a way of communicating that you have that will draw people in. So I'm glad that you're doing this, especially at such a time as this. Um,
Hmm.
I think there's a reason this sparked in your mind to do. So I'm excited
Yeah.
to be joining you today.
Oh, I appreciate that very much indeed. Wonderful. Well, let's begin. And I too am feeling really appreciative that we have Dr. Daniel Emina with us today. What a privilege. And I'd love just to, Daniel, share a little bit about you, share a little bit from your bio before we get started.
Of course.
So let's see. Dr. Daniel Emina is a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist who earned his medical degree from the University of California, Los Angeles School of Medicine. And he completed his general residency in psychiatry and child adolescent psychiatry fellowship at the University of Hawaii Department of Psychiatry.
Yep.
He is an associate medical director of the Amen. Is it Amen or Amen?
Amen Clinics.
Amen Clinics. Got to get
Yeah.
that right. Amen Clinics, a nationwide network of pioneering brain health clinics founded by Dr. Daniel Amen.
Yes.
He enjoys working with children and adults and is well versed in individual, family, couples, and group psychotherapy. He's experienced in the treatment of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, mood disorders, addiction, ADD, ADHD, impulsive disruptive behavior disorders, autism spectrum, psychotic disorders, OCD, PTSD, and TBI. Wow. He approaches treatment with a foundational belief that each person is born with a purpose and sees brain health as a vital part of achieving this purpose. Dr. Emina is a board member of the Center for Child and Family Development and a council member of the One Hit Away Advisory Council. He's also a board member and treasurer for the Extended Arms Initiative in LA. And he is the co-author of the book, The Suicide Solution, which will be released later this year.
Yes.
Awesome. We'll look forward to that.
Yes.
You got to let us know when it's released. We want to get that.
I definitely will.
Good. We want to get that word out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's begin. And Daniel was willing to come and talk with us today about this really important topic of depression. And something obviously by no means new, but it seems to be something that a lot more people are struggling with during the pandemic. And I'd love to start with, since we're talking really about teens here, start with the question, Daniel, around what do you think are some of the things that parents can be looking out for that when they're adolescents, when they're teens or depressed, that could be potential warning signs that their teens are at risk?
So this is extremely important question, especially in the context of where we are right now in the world and when we are in the world. Every 14 minutes, someone dies by suicide in the United States. Um, Suicide is obviously one of the things as a psychiatrist we watch out for, and we do all we can to hopefully prevent. As a clinician, there's always the worst case scenario of any kind of condition you treat, and for a psychiatrist, that tends to be one of the worst case scenarios.
Mm.
Right. So if you're an oncologist, it would be dealing with a cancer that you couldn't treat and leading it to someone passing away. For us, it's dealing with something like a depression or a psychotic illness that eventually leads to someone passing away.
Mhm.
So we're very attentive to this, and we're very attentive to trends in society. Unfortunately, suicide is now the 10th leading cause of death overall, and actually it's the second leading cause of death for those 10 to 34.
Okay.
And actually, there's some new evidence showing up that it might actually end up being the number one leading cause for 10 to 34 for death.
Wow.
Number one used to be unintentional injury, but in the context of this spike that's been occurring since 1999, it's starting to move up, unfortunately.
Mm.
And there's multiple different reasons for that. That's another talk in itself of why we're seeing this increase.
Mm.
But one of the ones that obviously we're most concerned with recently, as of 2020, is the pandemic. The pandemic has only worsened this trend, and we'll talk about potentially how it's done that. But the rate of depression is now 3 times what it was. There's more substance abuse. There's more deaths linked to overdose. There's just more suicides and suicide attempts. There's more alcohol-related use and overall abuse of substances.
Mm.
There are many reasons we've seen this, unfortunately. And one of the things that we've seen, and this is actually a newer stat, I actually just looked this up recently. The Centers for Disease Control actually did a study on this, just to kind of track the trends that were occurring over this last year. And in June of 2020, they put out this questionnaire. And they actually found that in this questionnaire, 1/4 of young adults had reported having seriously considered suicide.
Wow.
So 1/4, 1 in 4 of young adults had considered seriously, not just considered, not just a fleeting thought, seriously
Mm-hmm.
considered suicide. That's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to be aware of it, not only aware of depression overall, but aware of this tendency sometimes for some to be more vulnerable to suicide, and then what to do to treat it or manage it, even
Mm-hmm.
as a parent, even as someone in the community. You don't have to be a clinician to be aware. So we're going to go over a couple of things to be looking for today. First thing that usually comes up next is, well, why is this happening? What causes suicide? Why would people even think in such a way? Well, there are reasons. Simple ones that most of us can probably think of is if someone goes through a loss, right? There's a major loss, there's a breakup, there's a death in the family, sometimes they can trigger those kind of thoughts. If they've been bullied, if they're under chronic stress, if their family has rejected them, if they're isolated, if they've had a medical condition, if they've been hit in the head. So TBI, traumatic brain injury, it's actually something we specialize at the clinic I work in, has been shown that unfortunately there's an increased risk for depression, even increased risk for suicide and suicide attempts. A family history of suicide can put you at risk for suicide. Obviously, a previous suicide attempt actually increases your risk, as you would guess, of a future completed suicide attempt. So most of the time, for every suicide attempt, I think it's like 25 to 1. So there's maybe 25 suicide attempts for in general population to 1 completed suicide attempt.
Okay.
But you got to pay attention to all of those, because unfortunately one of the greatest risk factors to a completed suicide attempt is that the person already tried once in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone has already tried once, we need to be intervening and intervening aggressively.
Okay.
Other things that impact it: trauma, abuse, substance abuse, either in the family or in the individual, any mental related disorders that have been diagnosed, whether it's depression, anxiety, substance abuse, exposure to suicide in the community or in the media. Keep that in mind. As far as it's shown more now, there's some evidence that there can be almost a little bit of contagion at times,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's someone in the community who may have had suicide, someone else is having similar thoughts, and then now that someone else has kind of done it, it potentially may allow for the other new individual to do it.
Okay.
We've also seen that this one may not be one that people think about often, but teens who identify as LGBTQ who have experienced negative reactions or rejection to the coming out process are often at increased risks.
Mm.
Right?
Okay.
And just even more basic than that, we've done imaging studies on brains, and we've found that there's certain patterns of activity that make some people a little bit more susceptible to suicidal thinking and suicidal actions.
Mm.
Okay, there can be differences in parts of the brain, how the frontal lobes fire, how the temporal lobes fire, how a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate fire, and activity patterns that can actually relate to negative thinking, having more angry and darker thoughts, or being more impulsive. You
Okay.
combine those together, and unfortunately, it can lead to an impulsive suicide attempt.
Okay.
Now, there are things that are specific to our current age, right? We're dealing with COVID. We're dealing with COVID-specific stressors, the stay-at-home orders, obviously, right? People
Mm-hmm.
aren't able to do what they used to do, right? There's social distancing, there's less community, there's less social activities, less religious supports, barriers to mental health in general. You can't even just see your counselor, your school counselor like you normally would. Um, some homes are not safe.
Mm.
There's increased intimate partner violence, child abuse. The country is divisive and fearful at this point.
Yeah.
Gun sales are up. Everybody thought it was the end of the world, so people were buying guns and toilet paper, right?
Mm.
Loss of coping strategies. You're not able to do the things you normally would have done naturally. You didn't even think about them, but they used to help you feel happy. Going
Mm-hmm.
to movies, going to a nice dinner, going for a walk with friends, hanging out with friends, commiserating with friends, getting a coffee. All of a sudden, you don't have those opportunities now, and you grow increasingly isolated, and people get depressed and further.
Mm-hmm.
And people get bored and then even potentially start abusing substances, which is another risk factor for suicide.
Mm.
Financial stress, right? Families are dealing with a lot right now, jobs closing down, losing their
Yeah.
jobs. Um, Here are the biggest warning signs. So all these things, I'm sure people are listening and going, well, check, check, check. We've all
Mm-hmm.
been dealing with this all year. Does that automatically mean that everybody's going to be suicidal? No, no. But there are things to watch out for specific individuals. Has their way of speaking changed? Are they more hopeless? Are they talking about being in pain? Are they saying they're a burden? Have they actually started using more substances? I'll use that as a red flag. Are they smoking more cannabis? Are they using more alcohol? The challenge with any of those substances is that there's also a rebound effect as to what they can cause as far as mood symptoms, so they can get more depressed
Mm-hmm.
over time. Uh, Often, suicide attempts, up to a quarter or more individuals are often intoxicated when they do an attempt or even complete a suicide.
Really.
That's already one of the big markers we look for.
Mm.
If the individual is sleeping too much or too little, if they have these extreme mood swings, up, down, rageful, if they just seem more vengeful or angry, they're talking about revenge, things like that. And if they're just extremely withdrawn. When you start combining risk factors like this, you start to potentially pique your interest and help you be more intentional about what you do next. So, in
Mm-hmm.
summary, here, it's really about being aware that we're all in a stressful state, being aware of the individuals around us and how is the stress impacting them. How are they communicating this stress, and how are they problem solving this stress? If they're not problem solving it, if they're moving to a place of hopelessness, if they're abusing substances, your interest should be piqued and you should be looking to do more.
Okay. Wow. So much important information you were able to just, summarize so quickly. Thank you, Daniel.
Of
And
course.
you're leading in right to a next question I
Yeah.
have, which is, what do we do, as parents? What do we do to try to help?
Yeah. As parents, you love your kid. You'll do anything for your kid.
Mhm.
You never want to see your kid in pain. Um, so my hope is that some of the things we discuss here empowers parents, empowers friends or other family members. It can be grandparents or such on what to do. There's some basic initial steps that I'll talk about now, and there's even the next question. I'm going to reference some things that parents, caregivers, family members can be doing that can be supportive of someone who's in that state of despair or suicidal thinking. But first couple of things to think about is just don't ignore it. Don't say, well, everybody's going through a rough time right now. It's going to go away. We'll just let it,
Mm-hmm.
he or she will figure it out. Don't ignore it. Be aware, choose to be aware, and then choose to be intentional about how you manage or interact in that relationship to help bring support. It doesn't mean you have to go and fix it, but just initial first step is be aware. So look for signs of depression. Look for threats. Don't ignore them stating, I don't want to be alive. Don't go, oh, you're just being melodramatic teen.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
Pay attention. This is an increasingly stressful time. Even for your teen that you may have thought, well, they can get manipulative at times, still be aware.
Mm-hmm.
Still be aware. Still take that seriously.
Okay.
Right? Obviously, you don't let them use that as a negotiation tactic on a
Mm-hmm.
side note,
Mm-hmm.
but still be aware. And it's going to relate to some of the suggestions I'll make later. Next thing is just listen and observe. If they're saying statements like nothing matters, sometimes I wish I could just go to sleep and never wake up, everyone would be better off without me. If they're just gotten to a point where you don't have to even worry about me much longer, if they're saying things like that, if they've reached that point, be willing to listen non-judgmentally.
Mm.
Okay, that's the first step. Instead of, you don't mean that, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. That's silly. Just listen first.
Mm.
Commiserate. Hear them. Show empathy. This must be really difficult, what you're going through, what you're feeling. I can only imagine. You don't have to equate your own experience with theirs, because some people may not accept that as much, or it may feel like you're invalidating their experience.
Mm.
But be able to say, I'm here with you. We can figure this out together. How can I be of support? Some will jump towards that. Some will push you away. Even if they do, don't give up. We'll in a moment discuss other intentional ways of being able to provide support, even if they're not quite ready to
Okay.
receive your support. The other piece is, don't be afraid to share your feelings a little bit. Don't minimize their anguish. As I mentioned before, reassure that these times can and will get better, but share your feelings. It makes me sad to see you so sad. Um,
Mm.
it it I'm hopeful that together we can work on this. It makes me happy when I see us trying to figure this out together. Share the fact that you've had some distress, if the individual is in the space to listen for that.
Okay.
Sometimes drawing each other in to solve it together sometimes can be motivating for the other individual.
Mm.
Big one, encourage your team not to isolate. Uh, we're already isolated. Further isolating into the room and getting stuck on some uh, Reddit feed or reading something online and just being focused on their phone or their devices can be extremely destructive during this time.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't use screens. People have used screens now more to communicate with their friends,
Mm-hmm.
but be
Mm-hmm.
aware of if they're pushing too much into isolation. And a huge one, decrease some of the demands. Doesn't mean that they won't have any responsibilities. They may still need to do some chores, but if there are high demands, there are high pressures, high expectations, decrease some of them. I mean, an obvious one is some of the academic expectations.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean they don't do anything and they play video games all day. That's not what we're saying. They'll still need to use that time that would normally be academic to focus on some levels of academics. But the pressures of an argument around it, did you turn everything in, and do you have the A, B's, and C's? If it's leading to overall too much contention, sometimes just taking a step back, especially in the context of an individual where you're concerned about depression.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the specifics here. If your kid isn't depressed at all, you might still encourage them to get their work done, even still keeping in mind that we're dealing with COVID. But for an individual who's depressed, you're concerned, you might, hey, let's not worry too much about that right now. I'm more concerned about you, right?
Right.
Because they need to hear that. They need to hear that your concern lines with them. And my last one here is a very basic one. If you have anything that could be used in the home to harm themselves, they could use. The most obvious one is a gun.
Mm-hmm.
Remove it from the home, secure it extremely well, however you need to. Because unfortunately, what we've seen in the studies is that if there's a completed suicide, so not just thinking about it, but a completed suicide, that home was 4 to 5 times more likely to have a gun in it.
Okay.
The states where there's more gun ownership, there's more suicide, more completed suicides, right? Because the
Okay.
individual has access to a gun, which if you use it.
I think I just lost you.
Okay, am I back?
There, you're back.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries. The last thing that we heard was that because they've got access to a working gun, it leads to more completed suicides. Yeah.
Yeah, so in states, and this is a true stat, unfortunately, more access, more completed suicide. So definitely get the guns out of there. Now, if you obviously have a whole bunch of medicines for medical conditions or anything like that, also work towards securing that if that's an area of
Okay.
concern.
All right. Wow. Thank you.
Of course.
Yep, for one more.
Yes,
One more
of course,
question.
of course.
Oh, so important. Um, the last piece I'd like to ask you about, Daniel, is, there's the mental health of everyone in the household. And as
Mm-hmm.
you said, as parents, you don't want to see your kids suffer. That's the last thing you want to see.
Yeah,
It's hard though. It's hard for parents if their kids are suffering, for the parents to not take that on and to feel that, the kids in those moments when they're up, it's easier for a parent to be up.
yeah,
When the kid's down, it's easy to join them and to be in
yeah.
that place. So do you have suggestions around how parents can try to take care of themselves when that is the situation?
So first things first, that's extremely common, right? I mean, even I'm a parent to a very young child. She's 18 months,
Mm.
right? So if she's having a tough day for whatever reason, everybody's in the house is having a tough day,
Yeah.
right? If she's having a great day, it doesn't matter what I'm dealing with. I'm having a great day. Okay.
Mhm.
So I know what it's like, even just starting from such a young age. So imagine that, how you extrapolate that out to the teen years and all the multitude of emotions that teens go through and the intensity of emotions. Now, unfortunately, if a child is feeling a depression, that can bring a weight to the house.
Mhm.
That can bring a weight to every dynamic and every interaction. So earlier I used the word intentional in answering some of my other questions, the other questions that came up. But we have to be intentional about how we navigate that relationship with your child. And it actually starts first by being intentional about how you take care of yourself.
Mm.
So it's not even just purely about your child. It's what state am I in at this point before I jump to even taking care of my child. So here's the example on this one. If you remember when you're on a plane, or we could travel on the plane, they would have those videos, and if there's a loss of pressure, the thing will pop down for oxygen. What do they always tell you? Put
Put
it
your
on
oxygen
yourself
mask on.
first
Yeah.
before you put it on your little child after.
Hmm.
And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you're trying to put it on them and then you pass out, then no one's getting it on them and no one's getting it on you,
Yeah.
right? So self-care, even on something like this, becomes extra important, especially in the context of a pandemic that's impacting all of us and it's changing our way of life, and our cities and such are much more divisive. Our country is much more divisive. We're
Mhm.
all stressed.
Yes.
So first thing, Self-care, model self-care. I'm going to go through what that actually looks like. But the benefit of modeling self-care is, one, you're actually taking care of yourself, so you're healthier. So then if you're healthier, you're more intentional about the person you're going to be when you interact with your child.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another piece it does. It shows them what it looks like to take care of yourself and how important that is. And that you're not just going to be like, hey, child of mine, you should probably go exercise. I'm not going to do it, but you should probably do it because I read somewhere that I can help with depression.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
if I'm not doing it, if I'm not eating well, I'm still drinking too much wine at night, how is the child going to get up and go say, all right, I need to do it so I can be better off? The other element too is that if, my example already stated, there's a feedback dynamic that occurs with parents and their children. As if the child is not feeling good, it can make the parent not feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, if the parent's not feeling good, it can also impact the child. Somewhere along the way, someone's got to stop this game of tennis back and forth in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Of like, you're not feeling good, so I'm going to pass it on to you. Or it's like a hot potato thing. You're just kind of throwing it back and forth to each other. So if your child is not feeling good, they're in a state of depression. They may be thinking about suicide and such. They're not going to be the one that's going to go, all right, I'm going to figure this out. I'll stop passing my distress, my anxiety onto my parent. It's going to be on you to say, all right, I see your distress. I see your anxiety. I I hear you. I'm here with you. I take it in with you, but I'm not going to show you back distress and anxiety. That's not an easy thing to do, right? It's not an easy thing to stay hopeful and say, I am here with you. I'm hearing your pain with you, but I'm believing fully in my face and my body and my affect that you're going to be able to get through this.
Mm-hmm.
As a parent, that's very difficult to do, and I'm not saying that's easy, but you can't even start to do that if you're not taking care of yourself.
Okay.
A lot of the time, you don't have to solve the problem for your kid.
Hmm.
It's just you don't have to necessarily solve it. You're not going to be like, tell them some special phrase, some quote, some amazing thing that all of a sudden they'll click and they're like, I am undepressed. It usually doesn't happen like that, right?
Uh-huh.
It's a culmination of things that eventually lead someone to work their way out of depression. The biological process, the psychological process, it's a culmination of events that eventually helps them out of it.
Uh-huh.
So you're part of stewarding them, supporting them, walking alongside them so that they don't feel alone in the process. Right? So here's my model for self-care that I tell all my clients, that it can be something that's practiced by a parent and modeled to the child or the teen, is something I call the 4 C's. Practice the 4 C's. Okay, so I'm going to go over them. So C number 1 is connect. Okay. C number 2 is create. Number 3 is contribute. And number 4 is cultivate. And it really is cultivate your personal wellness, but I'll go through each of them and what they mean. Connect is obvious, okay? Connect with somebody else. It's in our nature, it's in our DNA to want relationship, to want connection, even for the most isolated of us. Even for my clients who are initially with the pandemic were like, I'm okay with this. I don't really like seeing people that much.
Mm-hmm.
After a while, you isolate too much, it will start to impact you. Right? There is that amount, there is that threshold of connection we all need. Some people need to connect every day, twice a day, 3 times a day. Some people just want one good quality connection, feeling understood, having conversation with somebody else once or twice a week, and they're good. But nurture relationships, nurture connections with friends or family. So parents also do this, create that model of, and that is important.
Okay.
Now in this also keep in mind, and this is a behavioral strategy, a behavioral training strategy, connect before you correct. So any parent who wants to create behavioral plans for their kids, step 1 is not really even purely the behavioral plan. Step 1 is, have you connected with your kid? Your kid's more likely to listen to you or even follow your model or your lead if you've built a relationship with them.
Mm.
And this doesn't have to be, let's sit here and talk about serious stuff. It can be, let's work on an activity together that you choose. Maybe they'll want you to choose, but sometimes it might be an activity that you choose, that they choose. And it can be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And the role of the parent there is to, it's hands off. You work with them, you follow their lead, but you don't direct them. You don't say you're doing it wrong. You just follow their lead and
Mm.
you listen. In the context of that, that's often when they will tell you some of these other thoughts that come through their mind. They're less likely to feel as comfortable usually just saying, hey, let's go sit on the couch and have this really serious discussion. They might, especially if they're depending on if they're the more talkative, but there's some of us who are just not as talkative. So initially just focusing on finding those quality moments to sit and talk, to sit in activity with each other, whether it's eating dinner and then the natural conversation comes from that,
Mm. Mhm.
or from some of the other activities I'll talk about in a moment. Connect before you correct. Connect can also help in your support for your child or family member who's going through depression or even suicidal thinking.
Okay.
They're more willing to even accept your support and help.
Mm.
The next one is create. So create is just creativity, using your creativity. When your limbic or emotional brain gets activated, and so that's the part of your brain that feels emotion, when it gets activated, it can manifest in depression, anxiety, and such.
Mm.
But it's also the part of your brain that feeds your creativity. It's often why some of our great artists will paint beautiful things, write beautiful music in the context of some distress that they felt. That limbic emotional brain's activated. So one of the best ways to utilize that superpower of an active emotional brain is channel it into something. So one, it can be a healthy distraction, but two, it can help you channel that emotion into a useful way, into something that you feel that you have a sense of control over.
Mm.
One, it's also another great way to share activity, right? So if you're working on something, building something together, drawing something, painting something, writing something, making music together, doing dance together, whatever it may be, cooking together can be a great way to share with each other. But even from parent down, model it. How am I using my creativity today, this
Mm.
week? Right. Big one here is also create something called a hope box. It can actually be a box. It can be a board, almost like a vision board type thing that includes things that bring you joy.
Mm.
It could be a picture of your pet, picture of a trip you're going on, picture of trips you went on before, friends, people that you feel are important to you. Something just to kind of go back to if you're feeling junky, you had a tough day. And you can model that for your child. You create one of this. Let's do this as a little crafts activity together.
Mhm.
It can be a nice little box. You can build something. You can make it pretty. You can do all sorts of stuff to it. For my woodworking people, you can do woodworking wise. You can do something pretty cool there too, and create little boxes. And again, that's channeling that creativity. That's channeling that creative brain into it. That's potentially creating a shared activity that helps with the connection piece that we talked about
Mhm.
earlier,
Mhm.
right? And it's helping you build a relationship. If you build
Okay.
a relationship, sometimes you don't have to solve the problem.
Mm.
You just feel that someone's there with you, and that sometimes alleviates the pain of the problem. The next one is contribute. So it's contributing to others. It's turning that internal focus of all on the negative thoughts, on the anxious thoughts. It's shifting that focus external as best as possible. So doing that is often in the context of how do I support others? How do I support my family? How do I volunteer? Um, and a parent obviously will want to contribute, support their child, but you may sometimes have to diversify that focus. You may, yes, support your child, but who are others you can support, right? In a way that doesn't deplete you, of course. You don't have to be on the phone listening to everybody's problems, but it might be a combination of supports that you provide. It's harder right now in the context of COVID, but there's still things we can do. I've actually have some of my clients get pretty creative with this And there's like virtual volunteering. There's certain tasks. There's like a website, you can look it up, where they can do virtual volunteering, different things they can do either online or remotely, or kind of like this. And it gives them another sense of purpose, right? It's a very helpful strategy overall for reducing one's own despair when you can kind of shift your focus externally and feel empowered. The last one is a big one. It's cultivate your personal wellness. So I just say cultivate, okay? But the personal wellness element of it is really all of this stuff we've been talking about, but now it gets to the nitty-gritty stuff, right? It talks about how you nurture your healthy thought life. So our thought life is like, it can be almost like akin to a garden. You have a garden, and you're planting seeds, and you get weeds that pop in there every once in a while. So you got to go through and pull out the weeds, and then you kind of take care of the nice little plants that are growing well, right? Our thought life can be like that too. The weeds are those ants. We call them ants, automatic negative thoughts. They're growing up there. You can choose to go and water that ant. You can choose to go water that weed, meaning paying attention to it, focus on it, emphasizing it, choosing not to water the positive thoughts, choosing to prioritize those negative thoughts, those self-doubts, those worries. And I know it's easier said than done, but if we are early on in managing our negative thoughts, sometimes they don't grow into these giant weeds that overtake our entire garden, and we can't even see out of them anymore. Can't even imagine a positive thought coming through. So this nurturing that healthy thought life is taking care of our own internal garden. Choosing to challenge those negative thoughts that pop in so that they don't grow and grow and grow bigger. I will never get better. That's a negative thought. Your emotional brain's going to react to that. That's going to eventually lead to despair. That's eventually going to demotivate you and lead to behaviors that don't support your overall health. But if you challenge that thought of, I'm never going to get better, I'm like, well, is that true? Is there a chance I could get better? Maybe there's a chance, 10%, 20%, or 50%? If there is a chance, then what would I need to do to get better? Has there been anybody else who's ever got better before from something like this? Am I the only one who ever had this before? Even just pushing back. And it's not to invalidate any thoughts that come through. It's just to say, is there a better way of thinking about this? Is there a more complete way of thinking about this? Right? Next, after that, and that's in itself, there's therapies that do that, right? They just spend time going back and forth on that. But it's such a key one. Next after that is meditation practices, breathing practices. I just even love basic breathing practices where you're doing the belly breathing, have your belly go out. It's a great way of calming ourselves. If you're going to have a serious discussion, doing a few rounds of that, even 10 sets of that, counting to 4, holding your breath, exhaling, count to 4, hold your breath, inhale, count to 4, and just repeat the cycle maybe 10 times. We call that square breathing. Okay. Beautiful practices like that can help decrease our anxiety, our agitation, especially if we're going to have a tough discussion with a family member or friend or boss. And then the basic ones we all know: eat better. If you're depressed and you eat a bunch of sugar, you'll feel a little better for a bit, but then you're going to crash and feel more depressed, and then you're going to want to eat more sugar again, and then you're going to keep that cycle going, then you're going to gain more weight than you wanted to, then you're going to be depressed that you gain more weight, and it feeds that cycle, right? A lot of the foods we eat with sugars and preservatives and such actually are making people more depressed. So if you're not feeling good, if you're feeling depressed, eat better. If your child is not feeling good and depressed, make sure that there's healthy foods in the home. Make it a little bit harder to get some of those unhealthy foods, right? Model what healthy eating is. And then a big one, exercise. Exercise has been shown to be as effective as medication at times, and even as therapy at times, if you're doing it intensely enough. At minimum, do 30 minutes 3 times a week. You can do it now with the computer screens. You can load up a YouTube and do a little mini exercise there now.
Yeah.
You can even do it on your phone. Yes, it's harder to go to the gym, but there's a lot of things now we can do even at home. Sleep. Teens don't
Mm,
sleep enough sometimes.
mm,
Teens actually sometimes need to sleep 8 to 10 hours, but they'll get into cycles where their sleep schedule is completely off and they're sleeping at 2, 3, 4 a.m., but they still got to get up for school, even if it's remote school, and they're tired. You do that for a few months, sometimes that's the reason they're depressed.
mm,
They're not sleeping enough, they're not eating well enough, they're not exercising well enough, and now they're depressed. And sometimes it's just purely biological. It has nothing to do with all the other millions of stressors that we are dealing with.
mm,
The last two things is screen time, screen time, screen time. If there's been any discussion that I have with all my clients that have kids, it's this one. Comes up quite a bit. You go past 2 hours, your risk for depression starts to go up.
mm.
But of course, all of us are on screens all day. We're on Zoom all day. We're doing school all day. So we're going to have to change the way we kind of think about screen time. What we've found is that the more screen time, the less likely you are to do the diet, the exercise, get enough sleep that you need to do. So the main thing is make sure you're still doing all those other things and make sure the
Mm.
screen time isn't getting in the way of you doing those other things and make sure the screen time isn't getting in the way of you having a one-to-one in-person human relationship. That's often one of the best ways to manage screen time at home is, hey, you can have your screens as long as it's not interfering with our relationships here. If we're at a dining table, we're eating dinner, and you're on your screen, that's interfering with our relationships. You're too important to me for you to be on the phone while we're trying to build our relationship and nurture our relationship here. They may not like that, but it's important to nurture that. But the thing is, as a parent, you'll have to also practice that, right? You can't be also on your phone and then telling your kid not to be on your phone,
Yeah.
right? And then the last one, substances. We have to model that as parents. You can't be overusing alcohol and then telling your kid not to overuse whatever substance they may be
Mm,
using, if it's cannabis or such.
mhm,
Uh, Model it there. Alcohol will decrease your frontal lobes. You may get depressed. You may be more impulsive. You may not hold your tongue when you should. You'll be less likely to be that intentional parent you want to be.
mhm.
Everything I've said so far with these 4 C's help the parent be healthier, help the parent manage their own anxiety, decrease that tendency to play that hot potato with anxiety and depressed feelings, and pro- provides a potential plan, a mirrored plan for your child to eventually live out that can also help support their health.
Mm.
Now, the obvious thing too is that we will at some point need help.
Yeah.
If your child is struggling, seek help.
Mhm,
It's not your job to do it all on your own. Often, with things like depression, things that are more brain based, sometimes or emotion based, sometimes the parents feel it's their job only to fix. Or it must mean that I wasn't showing them love or I wasn't being a good enough parent. No,
mm.
it can be just biological. If they broke their leg or they, God forbid, had some other kind of medical illness, you would take them to the doctor. They would work on it. You wouldn't feel bad about taking them to the doctor for that. Same
Yeah.
thing for this.
Mhm,
It's medical. There are brain-based changes that can occur that can make someone more depressed, more anxious, even suicidal.
mhm.
As needed, get them the help that they need.
All right. And it's not a sign of weakness, right?
It is not a sign of weakness.
Yeah. All right. I could listen to you all night. I could. You're such a fantastic resource and have such a wealth of information, Daniel, and just your way of speaking
Thank
um,
you so much.
makes me feel calmer,
Thank
listening
you
to
so much.
you. So I'm really excited for other parents and people to hear this message and to learn as I've been learning tonight by spending the time with you.
Thank you.
So you are wonderful. You
Thank
are
you so much.
wonderful. You're such a gift, and I really appreciate your willingness to share and be with us tonight.
Thank you so
So,
much. And as I said before, I think the mission you're on is going to touch a lot of lives. So keep it going. I think
yeah.
you have something in mind of what you're building and what you're doing. Be encouraged. I think this is a very important time to be doing this.
Mm. Thanks for joining me in it.
Thank you.
Elbow bump.
Boom.
All right. You have a wonderful night.
All
Thank you,
right. Thank
Daniel.
you so much. All
Bye-bye
right.
now.
Bye.